Charles Manson and Axl Rose do have a controversial connection. Sharon Tate's youngest sister Patricia even tried to get Guns N' Roses boycotted nationwide across the US. The California Attorney General's office even weighed in at one point and tried to see if they could prevent Charles Manson from getting any money from Guns N' Roses. So what exactly happened here? Why would Charles Manson even get money from Guns N' Roses? I'm going to explore all of that and more in this video. Now, of course, Axl Rose had nothing to do with the actual Manson murders. Axl was only 7 when the killings happened in August of 1969. At the time, Axl was living in Indiana, which is on the other side of the country from California. But regardless, unfortunately, Axl Rose has repeatedly shown admiration for Charles Manson over the years. In 1993, following significant backlash, Axl Rose did put out a statement denying any admiration for Charles Manson. But actions speak louder than words. For instance, on multiple occasions at the height of Guns N' Roses' fame in the early 90s, Axl repeatedly went on stage wearing shirts with Manson's face on it. Again, this wasn't a one-off thing, it happened many times. As a matter of fact, even in the music video for Estranged, one of the band's biggest songs, at one point, Axl is wearing a Manson shirt. In 2012, a book about the Manson murders, which was co-authored by Sharon Tate's niece, Bree Tate, was published. The book is titled Restless Souls, and in this book, Patricia, Sharon's sister, recalls seeing Axl Rose wearing a Manson shirt in a video on MTV, possibly the aforementioned music video for Estranged. But this isn't the main thing Axl did which infuriated the Sharon Tate family. The main issue is that Axl recorded a cover of a Charles Manson song and included it on a Guns N' Roses album. Not only did the Tates feel that this was glorifying Charles Manson, but Charles Manson was also eligible for significant royalties because of this. Apparently, Charles Manson could have earned hundreds of thousands of dollars in royalties just from that one cover. Understandably, this did not sit well with the Sharon Tate family. The Charles Manson song in question is called Look at Your Game, Girl. According to Guns N' Roses guitarist Gilby Clark, the rest of the band did not think it was a good idea to include a cover of a Manson song on their next album. But regardless, Axl Rose did do a cover of that Charles Manson song and included it on Guns N' Roses' next album, The Spaghetti Incident. Released on November 23, 1993, The Spaghetti Incident was a cover album. Guns N' Roses recorded their own versions of different songs by different artists, including the Axl Rose cover of the Charles Manson song. Predictably, this caused a lot of backlash. People were not happy that Axl Rose would cover Charles Manson. With all the controversy the situation created, Axl disowned Manson publicly, stating, quote, "Manson's a sick individual. Look at Manson and look at me. We're not the same," end quote. However, with all due respect, given the fact Axl's worn Manson shirts on many occasions, including in the Estranged video, and given the fact he chose to cover and then publish a Charles Manson song, Axl's statement that he doesn't admire Manson rings a bit hollow to me. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that Axl Rose admired Manson for the murders, but clearly at one point, Axl had some level of admiration for one reason or another for Charles Manson. He gave that impression to a lot of people. As mentioned, Guns N' Roses guitarist Gilby Clark said that nobody else in the band but Axl thought it was a good idea to include a Manson cover on their album. Gilby was in the band from parts of 91 to 94. In an interview for UltimateGuitar.com, Gilby said the following about Manson and Axl to journalist Justin Beckner, quote, "Axl did that song, the Charles Manson cover, completely on his own. As far as I know, I don't think that any of the actual band members were on that track. I think this recording was something that was just important to him. But yeah, I have no idea how it happened. Sometimes that's just the way things happen in GNR. The record would come out and you'd go, wait a minute, where did that song come from? I think when we, the rest of the band, heard about that song, I think every one of us thought it wasn't a good idea. But once again, when the singer of the band wants something, if it's important to him, you're going to lose that fight," end quote. I actually interviewed Gilby from his home studio for my documentary What is Classic Rock back in 2015. I'm going to show you that interview with Gilby a bit later. But first, I want to read to you an article by journalist Fred Deller from mojoformusic.com where he goes over the details of the Axl Rose Charles Manson controversy. Quote, "Axl was impressed with Manson's recording. I like the words he recalled. It's about a woman who has thrown things away. She thinks she's gaining love, but she's gaining sadness. Eventually, the Guns N' Roses frontmen got around to taping a late-night acoustic version of the Manson song. It became an unlisted bonus track on the Spaghetti Incident. Released by Geffen at the end of November of '93, the album, featuring a series of punk and metal covers, sold nearly 190,000 copies in the first week of its release. Then, the sky fell in. Billboard reported that the California Attorney General's office was exploring the possibility that any profits made by Charles Manson from the Guns N' Roses album would be forfeitable. Patricia Tate, sister of Sharon Tate, called for the song to be taken off the album. A victim support group, after learning that Manson could make $250,000 in royalties, demanded Geffen records be banned across the nation. In any case, what eventually did happen to the royalties that Manson was owed? This problem was actually settled within a few days of the album's release. All the money made by the song were awarded to the son of Wyotech Frykowski, one of the victims of the Manson murders." End quote. My immediate question to this is, why did Wyotech's son get all the money, instead of the money being split between all the victims' families equally, for instance? And thus, I came across another article which explains why Wyotech in particular got the money. Interestingly, according to this article by journalist Danilo Castro from thethings.com, Manson initially made $62,000 in royalties. Quote, "Guns N' Roses decided to give a chunk of their album sales to the infamous cult leader Charles Manson. Why is a logical question to ask. The song, titled Look at Your Game Girl, was originally written by Manson in 1968. It captivated frontman Axl Rose. The rest of Guns N' Roses protested about the inclusion of the song, but Axl ultimately got his way. Now, covering a pre-existing song, of course, means the artist who originally wrote the song receives royalty payments. In this case, it meant that Manson would receive money from Guns N' Roses. This is where the media firestorm against the band really ignited. Many felt that Guns N' Roses was promoting the music of a mass murderer. And the fact that Manson would be getting paid as well was just the immoral cherry on top. David Geffen, the head of the band's record label, said the following to the Los Angeles Times. "I hope that if Axl had realized how offensive people would find this, he would never have recorded the song in the first place. The fact that Charles Manson would be earning money based on the fame he derived committing one of the most horrific crimes of the 20th century is unthinkable to me." Anyways, Guns N' Roses were already one of the best-selling rock bands ever by the time the Spaghetti Incident was recorded. They were guaranteed to sell lots of albums, which is why the royalty deal they struck with Manson was so troubling to fans. According to the Baltimore Sun, Manson would be paid $62,000 for every million copies the album sold. This royalty agreement only aggravated the situation. Billboard reported that the California Attorney General's office explored the possibility that any profits made by convicted mass murderer Charles Manson from his song could be legally forfeited, and Patricia Tate, sister of one of the Manson victims, called for a boycott of Guns N' Roses albums nationwide. Manson attempted to quell things over by labeling Manson a, quote, sick individual, but this did very little to endear him to his naysayers. The Spaghetti Incident would go on to sell 1 million albums worldwide, which meant that the incarcerated Manson would take home $62,000. Fittingly, given its controversial promo, the Spaghetti Incident would go on to be the worst-selling album in Guns N' Roses' entire catalog. In other words, Manson would have been paid significantly more if the cover song had been included on any other Guns N' Roses release. While the relatively low album sales for the Spaghetti Incident kept Charles Manson's royalties at a minimum, there was still confusion over what should be done with the $62K he was owed. It was eventually determined by Geffen Records that the royalties would go towards paying a lawsuit that was filed back in 1971. The lawsuit was won by Wyotech Frykowski, whose father, Wyotech, was one of the people killed by Manson and his followers in 1969. The lawsuit had a $500,000 federal court judgment that was renewed every 10 years, which meant that Manson owed a whopping $1.2 million by the time the Guns N' Roses album was released. David Geffen struck a deal with the courts that allowed the song royalties from Guns N' Roses to be paid to Frykowski as part of the money owed by Manson. Patricia Tate, the aforementioned sister of the late Sharon Tate, was openly critical of Geffen's decision. She said that it was merely a way of excusing the label's poor judgment. In Patricia's words, as far as Manson's royalties go, they are obligated through the lawsuits to give Frykowski that money. This is not something Geffen is doing out of the goodness of their hearts. I want this to stop. I want to see that song pulled off the album. Now, Geffen offered to send part of the royalties to Patricia Tate's nonprofit group, but she refused. In her view, Guns N' Roses and Geffen were playing with blood money. Bottom line, the song Look at Your Game Girl remains on all physical and digital copies of the Spaghetti Incident, though Guns N' Roses has never played the song live. End quote. Now, as mentioned, Axl Rose put out a statement in response to the criticism he was receiving for covering Manson. In my opinion, this statement is basically just Axl deflecting any responsibility for his decision and acting the victim. The following is his full statement. Quote, "It's come to my attention that some people have taken offense to a particular song on our new album. What it all boils down to is this. The Spaghetti Incident is 13 historical musical gems that may have been overlooked. For instance, in my home state, Indiana, I was ridiculed and physically attacked for my musical tastes. I thought it would be interesting for the so-called mainstream and the people who were against this material when I was a teenager to actually hear these songs. Maybe they'll hear something they like, and more importantly, maybe they'll go find the originals and like those even better. I enjoy our versions, but I like the originals more, including Look at Your Game Girl. The reason we didn't list the song on our album is we wanted to downplay it. We don't give any credit to Charles Manson on the album. It's a hidden bonus track. In my opinion, it's the media that are enjoying making a big deal out of Guns N' Roses covering a song that Charles Manson recorded. But if another band had recorded that song, it probably wouldn't have been of interest. The media needs their quote-unquote bad guys to guarantee some ratings, so they use Manson's name coupled with mine to promote their news programs. However, when I do something positive, like contribute to a charity, it's hard to get the news to pick up on those stories. The media is an interesting beast. Why did I choose to cover that particular song? Oddly enough, one of the things we do up at my house is have this game called Name That Artist. We play obscure songs and everybody tries to guess who the artist is. My brother Stuart found Look at Your Game Girl at a large record chain, and, needless to say, he won that round of Name That Artist. Personally, I like the lyrics and the melody of that song. Hearing it shocked me, and I thought there might be other people who would like to hear it too. I like the words because, to me, it's about a woman who has thrown things away. She thinks she's gaining love, but basically she's gaining sadness. It was very fitting for a personal situation I happen to be in. The song talks about how the girl is insane. I felt it was ironic that such a song was recorded by Charles Manson. Manson is a dark part of American culture and history. He's the subject of fear and fascination through books, movies, and the interviews he's done. Yet, most people hadn't heard anything Charles Manson recorded. A lot of people say that I wear a Manson shirt for shock value, but I've worn that shirt for the past year on tour all over the world. Yes, I was trying to make a statement. I wore that shirt because a lot of people enjoy portraying me as the bad guy and as a crazy person. But sorry, I'm not that guy. I'm nothing like Manson. That's what I'm saying. There's a difference in morals, values, and ethics between Manson and myself, and that is, thou shalt not kill, which I don't. I'm by no means a Manson expert or anything, but the things he's done are something I don't believe in. He's a sick individual. Look at Manson and then look at me. We're not the same. I think people think I'm crazy because I believe in telling the truth. I'll admit, sometimes I don't do a perfect job of it, but my efforts are true. It is my understanding that the song was written by Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. To what extent Charles Manson is involved in the publishing, I'm not aware. However, I am donating all my personal profits from having that song on our album to a charity, an environmental group to help protect wildlife and our oceans. In our video for Estranged, which will be the last video for the Use Your Illusion albums, we use dolphins, and this is my way of giving something back to the dolphin, which is endangered and threatened with extinction. End quote. I think Axl is a phenomenal frontman, but this statement is basically him just completely deflecting any responsibility for his bad decision. After reading this statement, it's pretty obvious why this did not go over well with people. Maybe, however, it did go over well with the dolphins. I don't know. It's also kind of ironic that Axl brought up the music video for Estranged in this statement where he's trying to deflect from Manson, given the fact in that music video he's wearing a Charles Manson shirt. Anyways, moving on from the statement, there were some interesting parallels in terms of the circumstances in which both Manson and Axl Rose grew up. I'm going to read to you an article by Dennis Earle from dennisearle.wordpress, where he explores some of the parallels between Axl and Manson, as well as more of the controversial history behind Axl Rose's recording of Look at Your Game Girl. Quote, on November 23, 1993, Guns N' Roses released their album The Spaghetti Incident. Rather than offer a collection of new songs, every track on The Spaghetti Incident is a cover. Some of these covers were recorded during the sessions for the Use Your Illusion CDs, while others were done during off days when the band was touring. This wasn't out of necessity, however, because the band did have new material to work with. However, despite having plenty of new material to jam on with his bandmates, Axl wanted to pay tribute to his punk and metal heroes instead, and thus did a cover record. Some of that new material which could have become Guns N' Roses songs ended up on an album called It's 5 O'Clock Somewhere by Slash's Snake Pit, which was essentially Slash's side project. Anyways, advanced copies of The Spaghetti Incident were sent to professional rock critics who mostly raved about the album. But there was one song they didn't get to hear, the hidden track Look at Your Game Girl, which was Axl's cover of a Charles Manson song. In early 1992, Axl started to wear various Manson shirts, usually black or red, during live concerts. Though it wouldn't have been much, the $17 shirt that Axl would wear could have generated some royalties for Manson, though very minuscule. Charles Manson would have earned a measly 10 cents for every one shirt sold, and the shirts were not selling a lot. They were manufactured by a company called Zuport Riot Gear. Established in the mid-80s, their modest headquarters were based in Newport Beach, California. Near the end of 1993, the owners told the Los Angeles Times that they had sold a few thousand copies of the Manson shirt. By 1994, however, the company claimed to have sold 25,000 shirts and caps bearing Manson's likeness. Thanks to a 1971 civil judgment against him, Manson, however, couldn't profit from anything regarding his image, because he owed $500,000 to a survivor of one of his victims. The suit was filed on behalf of the young Bartek Frykowski, the then 11-year-old son of Manson family victim Wyotech Frykowski. Wyotech had been stabbed 51 times, shot twice, and pistol whipped around the head 13 times. By 1993, because of accumulated interest, the unpaid settlement of $500,000 had grown to almost $1.5 million. Manson wasn't rich to begin with, so any of his future earnings would go directly to Bartek Frykowski. In a tragic irony, however, Bartek died in 1999. Police claim he stabbed himself to death, but that's not been accepted by his supporters who believe he was murdered. Bartek was only 40. It's not clear if his 3 children are continuing to collect royalties. In any case, the notorious Tate LaBianca murders aside, Axl Rose and Charles Manson did have a lot in common. They were born to teenage mothers. They both had toxic relationships with women. Neither had a good relationship with their father. Both were juvenile delinquents, both were abused, and both were accused of rape. Furthermore, even more specifically, both had experienced deep paranoia about the possibility of being attacked by unknown assailants. Both felt deeply misunderstood by the world and played the victim in the media. And both wanted to be rock stars. During his second to last stint in prison in the mid-60s, Manson started writing music. While incarcerated, he was befriended by Phil Kaufman, an eccentric record producer also in custody. A fan of Charles's vocal approach, Kaufman encouraged Manson's songwriting even though he didn't really care for his guitar playing. Kaufman ultimately convinced Manson to do a recording once he was released in 1967. Kaufman himself wouldn't be discharged until 1968 and would briefly become involved in Manson's cult, although he himself never became a true follower. After Manson was arrested along with a handful of his family members for murders of 7 people in late 1969, Kaufman received urgent phone calls from Manson demanding he release his recordings. Manson desperately needed the money for his defense, and also he wanted to soften his image. Manson's album Lie, The Love and Terror Cult, debuted on March 6 of 1970, the same day one judge in Manson's case stripped Manson of his ability to defend himself in court. In its initial independent run on vinyl, only a sixth of the 2,000 copies available were sold. The album has since been re-released multiple times, including in 2006, where the CD edition was expanded from 14 to 26 tracks. The very first track on side 1 of the original album is Look at Your Game Girl. According to Charles Manson, Beach Boy Dennis Wilson really liked the song. Along with producer Terry Melcher and songwriter Greg Jacobson, Dennis Wilson scheduled 2 recording sessions. There are about 10 songs, including another version of Look at Your Game Girl, which were recorded during the second session. Those recordings remain locked away, highly unlikely to be released. Despite these 2 recording sessions, no major label was brave enough or shameless enough to distribute Manson's music. Recorded during the final wave of Sgt. Pepper mania, Look at Your Game Girl would be forgotten for over 25 years until Axl Rose's version. When Axl informed his Guns N' Roses bandmates of his plan to record a cover of a Manson song, no one was really supportive. In Spin Magazine's July 1999 cover story about Axl Rose, ex-Guns N' Roses guitarist Gilby Clark said the following: "Axl played me the Manson song, Look at Your Game Girl, and I said, that's pretty good. Then he told me what it was, and I just went, what?" Tom Zuten, Guns N' Roses A&R guy, was equally perplexed. "The Manson thing was problematic," he said. "I could never understand why that song was so important to Axl." Publicly, lead guitarist Slash was half apologetic. He asserted the cover, which he doesn't play on, was done with naive and innocent black humor. Privately, however, it was more complicated. While some reports asserted that Slash was against including the song on the Spaghetti Incident, journalist Stephen Davis says that Slash was unfazed when he heard Manson's original demo. In any case, with absolutely no chance of the song being properly listed on the track list, it became a hidden song at the end of the album. At the end of the song, Axl quietly thanks Manson when he says, "Thanks, Chaz." When music critics were sent advance copies to review of the Spaghetti Incident, Look at Your Game Girl was deliberately excluded. However, it is on every single edition of the album sent to radio stations. If Geffen had such an objection to the song, why would they allow for that? Now, concerned about how the listed covers would be received by the public, early pressings of the Spaghetti Incident featured a band-approved sticker slapped on the front of the album. That sticker read, "Chock full of unsavory subject matter and explicit lyrics, etc., etc. So don't say we didn't warn you." When the press started covering the Manson connection to Look at Your Game Girl, shocked family members of the murder victims were appalled. The negative reaction to a song that most people had not actually heard of forced the band to consider dropping the song from future editions of the Spaghetti Incident, which, of course, they ultimately backed away from. When Manson died in 2017 after being incarcerated for nearly 50 consecutive years, there was a small funeral attended by his grandson. Sparsely attended by anyone else, roughly a couple of dozen mourners, songs from Manson's tiny catalog were played during the service. One of them was the uncredited version of Look at Your Game Girl from the Spaghetti Incident. End quote. Now, as discussed earlier, Axl Rose and Charles Manson did have quite a bit in common. Growing up, Charles Manson continuously got into trouble with law enforcement. So did Axl. Axl Rose was arrested more than 20 times as a teenager in Indiana. Manson also got into trouble as a teenager in Indiana. Like Axl, Manson actually lived in Indiana for quite some time. Charles Manson has never met his father. As per Axl Rose, his dad disappeared after he was about 2 years old. After his father abandoned him at 2 years old, Axl never met him again. As a matter of fact, many years later, an adult Axl Rose learned that his father was actually murdered in Illinois in 1984. Now, before Axl's father abandoned him at age 2, tragically, his dad allegedly molested him. For his part, Charles Manson has said that he himself was raped as a teenager by different people. Both Axl Rose and Charles Manson were viewed by people around them as dead-end kids who were going to amount to nothing. Well, for his part, Axl Rose became one of the world's most famous rock stars, whereas Manson became a mass murderer. Now, to be clear, despite the parallels between Axl and Charles in terms of their early life, Charles Manson did have an even more difficult life than Axl. And that's really saying something, especially when you remember that Axl allegedly was molested by his own dad. How much worse can you get than that? Well, Charles really had the upbringing from hell. This doesn't justify, by the way, the fact that Charles Manson became a mass murderer. There are some people out there who try to defend him and sympathize with him because of how difficult of an upbringing Charles Manson had. You can acknowledge the suffering that Charles Manson went through without taking that and twisting it into a perverted justification to defend his mass murders. Nothing justifies the murders Charles Manson committed. Nothing. So with that established, I want to read to you now a segment from Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, where he explores the history of Charles Manson's early life. Then I'm going to read to you a segment from Watch You Bleed, the saga of Guns N' Roses by Stephen Davis, where he discusses Axl's turbulent childhood. But first, Manson. Quote, Charles Manson was an unlikely candidate to become a charismatic cult leader. Born in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a 16-year-old mother and a father he never met, Manson knew little but suffering. He spent his earliest years in neglect. When he was still an infant, for instance, his mother was arrested for robbing a guy she thought looked rich. His mother was in prison for several years, and he was 8 when she was eventually released. Following her release from jail, Manson and his mom spent the next several months with a succession of unreliable men. Eventually, though, she pursued a traveling salesman in Indianapolis, marrying him in 1943 and trying to cut back on her own drinking. Manson, at this point not yet 9 years old, was already known as a troublemaker, known to steal from local shops. His mother looked for a foster home for him, but instead, he was sent to the Gabalt School for Boys, a Catholic-run school for delinquents in Terre Haute, Indiana. But Manson ran away, and his mother took him back in. According to Tex Watson, one of Manson's closest followers, Charles Manson had a special hatred for mothers. This probably had something to do with Manson's feelings about his own mother, though Manson never talked about her. The closest he came to breaking his silence about his mom was in some of his song lyrics. In Manson's song Mechanical Boy, for instance, he sings the following, I am a mechanical boy, I am my mother's boy. Manson was sent back to the Gabalt School for Boys, but within 10 months he ran away again, turning to burglary to keep himself afloat. His crimes soon landed him in a correctional facility in Omaha, Nebraska. He ran away from there too and started breaking into grocery stores. Now, at age 13, Manson was sent to the Indiana Boys School, a tougher institution where Manson claimed the other boys raped him. He learned to feign lunacy to keep them at bay, and he kept running away, 18 times in 3 years. In February of 1951, when he was 16, Manson broke out again, this time with a pair of other boys. They drove a stolen car across state lines, which is a federal offense. When a roadblock in Utah brought their escapade to an end, Manson was sent to the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C. Thus began a long stint in the federal reformatory system. From there, Manson went to the Natural Bridge Honor Camp, where he was caught raping a boy at knife point. He was then sent to a federal reformatory in Virginia, where he racked up similar offenses, and then to a reformatory in Ohio, where a run of good behavior earned him an early release in 1954. Though caseworkers had taken frequent note of his antisocial behavior and psychic trauma. In less than a year's time, Manson had a wife and a baby on the way. He took on various service jobs, but he couldn't give up stealing cars, several of which he drove again across state lines. Those crimes, plus his failure to attend a hearing related to one of them, earned Manson a 3-year sentence to Terminal Island, a federal prison in San Pedro, California, Los Angeles County. By the time he got out in 1958, his wife had filed for divorce. Manson turned to pimping to make a living. The following May, he was arrested yet again, this time for forging a government check for $37.50. This got him another 10-year sentence, but the judge was moved by the plea of a woman who said she was in love with Manson and wanted to marry him. Thus, the judge suspended the sentence right away, letting him go free. Manson, however, kept pimping, stealing cars, and scheming people out of their money. By this point, the FBI was surveilling Manson, hoping to bust him for violating the Mann Act. The Mann Act forbids the transportation of prostitutes across state lines. They were never able to bring the charge against him, but when Manson disappeared to Mexico with another prostitute, he was found in violation of his probation. The 10-year sentence he'd received earlier was brought into effect. The same judge who'd granted him probation now decreed, if there ever was a man who demonstrated himself completely unfit for probation, he is it. Stuck in prison now for the long haul, Manson took up the guitar and dabbled in Scientology. The prison staff noted his gift for charismatic storytelling and his enduring personality problems. Manson made no secret of his musical aspirations. From behind bars, he observed with great interest and envy the meteoric rise of the Beatles. When Manson was released at age 32, he'd spent more than half of his life in the care of the state. Manson said he preferred life in prison, so much so that he asked if he could simply remain inside. One report said he has no plans for release, as he says he has nowhere to go. End quote. The following is from Watch You Bleed, The Saga of Guns N' Roses by Stephen Davis, where he discusses Axl Rose's turbulent and abusive upbringing in Lafayette, Indiana. Axl didn't even know that the man he thought was his biological father wasn't really his biological dad until he was almost 20. It's a really crazy story. Quote, "It's not known whether Axl's parents ever married, since a marriage certificate has proved elusive to researchers. But if they did, it was probably a shotgun-type affair, and the marital relationship was an on-and-off thing. If they did marry, it would have been after Axl's birth, if they did. When Axl Rose was born on February 12, 1962, his mother, Sharon Linter, was unmarried and only 17. As a matter of fact, she was still in high school. Her pregnancy was an accident and unwanted, at least by her family. The father was William Rose, a troubled and charismatic local delinquent of maybe 19. Sharon and William's child, Axl, was not named Axl. He was baptized William Bruce Rose. He wouldn't be known as Axl until many years later. Baby William, the future Axl Rose, was often cared for by his grandparents from his mother's side. In 1964, when William Rose was 2, his parents split up. William Sr. acted out his own scenario of revenge when he was banned from the house for hurting Axl's mother. He apparently abducted his 2-year-old son and maybe even molested him. Whatever really happened to baby Axl, it was never spoken of again by the family, which treated these incidents with denial and shame. William Sr., Axl's father, then disappeared from Lafayette, Indiana, and never returned. The following year, Axl's mother married a man named Stephen Bailey. Stephen adopted his pretty young wife's son and gave him his last name. So William Rose, Axl, now became William Bailey. Axl kept this name, William Bailey, until 15 years later when he angrily cast that identity away. Axl's mother had 2 more children, so he grew up with 2 half-siblings, Stuart and Amy. Now, Axl's stepfather was deep into Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism is a relatively new offshoot of Christianity which gained traction in the 20th century. Despite Christianity being based on the principles of love and respect, Axl's stepfather was abusive. Axl was raised under a harsh regime and what Axl later described as regular beatings and psychic abuse. The sensitive young Axl responded to this immediately, suffering nightmares and other symptoms. Sometimes, Bill's dreams were so disturbed he fell out of the top bunk in the room he shared with his sister. Later in life, he said he suffered seizures. Once, a young Axl awoke on the floor, bloodied because he had pierced his bottom lip with his teeth. Now, notably, in Axl's early school years, he would wonderingly describe for his parents vivid night visions of being a baby and living in a house with his mother and another man, a strange man who did bad things to him. Young Axl had no idea that his stepfather, Stephen Bailey, was not his biological father. His parents told him that these visions were false. Axl's home life was not stable. Sometimes when he was bullied and tormented by his stepfather, who he thought was his biological dad, Axl would turn to his mother for help. But she was afraid of her husband and couldn't help her wild-hearted son. Axl's mother had her own problems. As Axl once recalled, "I remember watching something horrible happen to my mother once after she came to help me. I got a lot of violent, abusive thoughts towards women out of watching my mother with this man." Things started to really go badly for Axl when he was 16. He was going through his mother's drawers one day and came across some old papers. He found his mother's high school diploma, yet it had a different name on it from her maiden name. Most starkingly, insurance papers he found in his mother's drawers described Axl as not the son of his dad Stephen Bailey, the person he at least thought was his dad, but rather of someone named William Rose. Axl, who up to this point in his life thought his name was William Bailey, realized after reading these papers that his actual name was William Bruce Rose. He confronted his mother, and she told him the truth, or at least some of it. When his dad, or at least the man he thought was his father, came home from work, they had a meeting of sorts. His parents told Axl that his real father had hurt his mom and was no good, and they just didn't want to talk about him ever. Axl asked where his real father was, and they told him they didn't know and didn't want to know. Axl was getting the idea that something terrible had happened with this guy, but they wouldn't really tell him about it. As a matter of fact, Axl noticed his mother's eyes would grow black with fury whenever he mentioned his real father. He went to his relatives, his uncles, but no one would tell him anything except that his dad, Bill Rose, was a bad actor, a troublemaker, and was more than likely dead. If Axl would try to say something at home, his parents would tell him, "Your real father does not get brought up." At the same time, Axl, whose name at this point was officially still Bill Bailey, changed his name. He told his friends that from now on he wanted to be called W. Rose. One of the short-lived local bands he'd sung with was called Axl, which then became his moniker. When the band broke up, he kept using the name and styled himself W. Axl Rose. That is how the name Axl Rose was born. Bill's mood swings became more violent and uncontrolled, and some of the kids in school were afraid of him. Some of the cops in Lafayette were even afraid of him. A psychiatrist noted Axl's high IQ and decided that Axl's behavior indicated intermittent psychosis. His arrest record grew longer and his grades dropped way down. Then, towards the end of his junior year in 1978, he dropped out of high school. In September, however, he tried to return for his senior year. But after some fights and another arrest, everyone agreed that he leave the high school and try something else. Everyone suggested that Axl get some help, but it is unknown whether he received any significant professional counseling in this period. Axl once reflected on this period of his life and summed it up in the following way. "You know, I grew up in a place where I got sick of being made fun of. I was kicked out of my house when I was 16 because my dad was real strict and I wouldn't cut my hair. They called me a drug addict when I was actually running cross-country and completely into healthy living. So, I left my home, got into beer, drugs, and went to jail about 20 times. 5 of those times I was guilty for what they busted me for, disturbing the peace. The other times, however, were for the simple reason that the cops hated me. But regardless, I always kept my hair long. When I went back to high school, where I knew that certain people had respect for me, some of the athletes and student council types, and suddenly, they didn't. They thought I was a hippie now because of my long hair. But I wasn't really friendly with the hippies because I liked all kinds of music. If you thought Devo or the Sex Pistols were good, you were a punk rocker. If you liked Bowie or the Stones, they'd call you a fag. So now, to them, I was a hippie punk fag all at the same time." End quote. So as you can see, Axl grew up in a very unstable situation, which is interestingly a very similar story to so many other iconic artists. Whether it's Axl, whether it's Kurt Cobain, whether it's Jim Morrison, there are so many iconic musicians who grew up in unstable situations, but were able to challenge that emotional abuse, that emotional trauma in a positive way. Manson did the exact opposite. He became a literal mass murderer, not to mention a rapist. Given the extremity of the Manson murders, it's often overlooked that Manson committed many other crimes as well, many heinous crimes such as rape, including raping minors. Manson, in addition to all his other crimes, was literally a pedophile rapist. He was once caught raping a minor at knife point, for instance. There are many documented instances where Manson raped minors. Unfortunately, regarding Guns N' Roses, in December of 1985, there was an infamous, well-documented incident involving statutory rape. During the early stages of Guns N' Roses in the mid-80s, the band lived together in this house, which they dubbed the Hell House. A place where rock and roll debauchery ran wild, most notably, most infamously, in December of 1985. The following is from journalist Mick Wall from Medium.com. Quote, "In December of 1985, a dark and serious incident took place which signaled the end of the Hell House era. A 15-year-old girl named Michelle entered the rehearsal space one day and, according to an interview Axl gave to the LA Weekly, she started messing with the band's equipment. There was some kind of scuffle and the girl ended up running naked along Sunset Boulevard. Now, Michelle was not a random. She was known to the band. She'd hung out around the Hell House periodically along with lots of others and had found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. In Axl's words, this hippie chick wandered in and started screwing with our equipment, trying to break stuff. So eventually, she wound up running down Sunset naked, all dingy, and didn't even know her own name." For his part, Slash, in his autobiography, stated the following, "My memory of the events is hazy, but from what I remember, she had sex with Axl up in the loft. Towards the end of the night, maybe as the drugs and the booze wore off, she lost her mind and freaked out intensely. Axl told her to leave and tried throwing her out. I attempted to mediate the situation to get her out quietly, but that wasn't happening. Again, that was Slash's recollection. A naked underage girl running away from adult men along one of the busiest streets in Los Angeles was not going to go unnoticed. Within a few hours, the LAPD, the police department, were back at the Hell House with the girl. They were looking to ID her assailants. Everyone in the house was brought outside except for Axl, who was hiding behind some equipment along with another girl. While the cops are outside harassing everybody, asking stupid questions, I'm with this girl behind the amp and we start going at it. Axl later boasted. That was the rush. I got away with it. It was really exciting. The police left, warning the band that Axl needed to turn himself in. Within a few days, the garage had been raided and searched. Again, at the time, Michelle was 15, whereas Axl was 23, and Slash was 20. The band was told that the girl and her parents were pressing charges of statutory rape against Axl and Slash. A minor is considered by law as incapable of giving consent to sexual intercourse. Despite Axl's bravado, he and Slash quickly skipped the scene when the reality of a possible 5-year mandatory jail sentence hit home. Slash retreated to an apartment drummer Steven Adler was sharing with a new girlfriend, Monica, who was a stripper. Whereas Axl slept rough in West Hollywood, making use of the Tower Records parking lot and bathrooms in gas stations and cheap restaurants. The band were now afraid to play live in case Axl or Slash were both arrested at the gig. They subsequently canceled the show and did not take any further bookings. Growing desperate, Slash rang Vicky Hamilton, their promoter and manager, and begged her to take Axl in for a few days. Vicky had a 1-bedroom apartment near the Sunset Strip. She once recalled the following. I got a call from Slash, asking if Axl could stay, and I asked why. Slash replied, well, it's kind of important. The cops are looking for him. And so I asked, why are the cops looking for him? Slash replied that Axl had a girl up in the loft, and I guess they had sex, but then he got mad at her and locked her outside without her clothes. She went to the cops and said that he raped her. I was stunned, Vicky recalled. I didn't know what to say. Slash sort of begged, so I said, okay, for a few days. Minutes later, Axl walks through the front door. Oh my goodness, thank you so much, Vicky. You saved my life. I asked him what happened. Axl said very little, other than that it was stupid, involving a girl. It won't ever happen again. He didn't give me any more info. Everything I heard about the incident from that point on was hearsay. Over the next few months, Hamilton's tiny 1-bedroom apartment became the de facto crash pad / center of operations for Guns N' Roses. Vicky even found Axl a lawyer to represent him on the rape charge. Although Vicky Hamilton recalls several visits from the police and many lawyers' phone calls, the rape charges were withdrawn at some point during this period. The case against Slash was given a court date but later dropped. Axl did have to find a suit and appear at a court hearing, but his case was also dropped through a lack of hard evidence. Instead, when word of the incident swept along the Sunset Strip, instead of damaging them, it seemed to fuel Guns N' Roses' reputation as rock and roll outlaws. A wild rumor had been circulating that the charges had been dropped after Axl slept with the mother of the girl concerned. No one seemed bothered that a 15-year-old had been through a harrowing experience. Instead, once the threat of prison time began to recede, Guns N' Roses even played on it, producing a flyer with the words at the bottom, "Send donations to Guns N' Roses Keep Us Out of Jail Fund." End quote. So, as I mentioned earlier, I did do an interview with guitarist Gilby Clark. Tension within the band and Axl's erratic behavior in particular were two of the main reasons the band's original rhythm guitar player Izzy Stradlin quit. Izzy was replaced by Gilby at the height of the band's fame. Now, before I switch over to that discussion and the Gilby Clark interview, I want to share one more segment with you from Tom O'Neill's book about Manson. Here, Tom O'Neill describes in graphic detail what exactly happened the nights of the Tate LaBianca murders. If you want to skip ahead straight to the Izzy Stradlin Gilby Clark section, it's the last 12.5 minutes of this video. As per the Tate LaBianca murders, here's what happened. Quote, August 8th, 1969. Late that night at the Spawn Movie Ranch near Chatsworth, Los Angeles, a man and 3 women got in a beat-up yellow 1959 Ford and headed towards Beverly Hills. A ranch hand heard one of the women say, "We're going to get some pigs." That woman was Susan Sadie Atkins, 21, who'd grown up mostly in San Jose. The daughter of 2 alcoholics, she said that her brother and his friends would often molest her. She had dropped out of high school and moved to San Francisco, where she'd worked as a topless dancer and gotten into LSD. "My family kept telling me, 'You're going downhill,'" she would later say. "So I just went downhill all the way to the bottom." Huddled beside her in the back of the car was Patricia Krenwinkel. 21, from Inglewood, Krenwinkel had developed a hormone problem as a kid, leading her to overeat and fear that she was ugly and unwanted. As a teen, she got into drugs and started to drink heavily. One day in 1967, she left her car in a parking lot, failed to collect the 2 paychecks from her job at an insurance company, and disappeared. In the passenger seat was Linda Kasabian, 20, from New Hampshire. She played basketball in high school, but she dropped out to get married. The union lasted less than 6 months. Not long after, in Boston, she was arrested in a narcotics bust. By the spring of 1968, she'd remarried, had a kid, and moved to Los Angeles. Sometimes she'd introduce herself as Yana the Witch. At the wheel was Charles Tex Watson, 23 and 6'3", from East Texas. Watson had been a Boy Scout and the captain of his high school football team. He'd sometimes help his dad, who ran a gas station and grocery store. At North Texas State University, he joined a fraternity and started getting stoned. Soon, he dropped out, moved to California, and got a job as a wig salesman. One day, he picked up a hitchhiker who turned out to be Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, a chance occurrence that changed both their lives forever. That night in August of 1969, in the yellow Ford, Tex, Susan, Patricia, and Linda were all dressed in black from head to toe. None of them had a history of violence. They were part of a hippie commune that called itself the Family and lived in isolation at the abandoned Spawn Ranch. More than anything, the family lived in accordance to the whims of their leader, the 34-year-old Charles Manson, who had commanded the 4 of them to take their trip that night in August. The 4 arrived at 150 Cielo Drive, where the actress Sharon Tate lived with her husband, the filmmaker Roman Polanski. Polanski was away in London at the time, scouting locations for The Day of the Dolphin, a movie in which a dolphin is trained to assassinate the President of the United States. The drive to Cielo would have taken about 40 minutes. It was just after midnight when they arrived. It was quiet there, seemingly worlds away from the hustle and sprawl of Los Angeles. The Tate House, built in 1942, had belonged to a French actress who'd modeled it on the Norman country estates of her youth. This beautiful house sat on 3 acres of isolated land nestled against a hillside. From this house, you could see views of Los Angeles glittering to the east and Bel Air's fulsome estates unfurling to the west. On a clear day, you could see straight to the Pacific 10 miles out. Anyways, Tex Watson scaled a pole to sever the phone lines to the house. Tex had been here before, and he knew where to find them right away. There was an electric gate leading to the driveway, but instead of activating it, the 4 elected to jump over an embankment and drop onto the main property. All of them were carrying buck knives. Watson also had a .22 buntline revolver. Kasabian remained on the outskirts, keeping watch. The other 3 crept up the hill toward the secluded estate. At the top of the driveway, they found Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was there visiting the caretaker in the guest house to sell him a clock radio. He was sitting in his dad's white car, having already rolled his window down to activate the gate control. Tex approached the driver's side of the car and pointed his gun at Stephen's face. "Please don't hurt me. I won't say anything," Stephen screamed, raising his arm to protect himself. Tex slashed his left hand with the knife, slicing through the strap of his wristwatch. Then he shot Parent 4 times. In his arm, his left cheek, and twice in the chest. Parent died instantly, his blood beginning to pool in the car. Those 4 shots rang out through the air, but no one in the house at 150 Cielo seemed to hear them. It was a rustic home of stone and wood. Finding no open windows or doors, Tex cut a long horizontal slit in a window screen outside the dining room and gained entry into the house. He went to the front door to let Atkins and Krenwinkel in. In the living room, the 3 killers came across Wyotech Frykowski, a 32-year-old Polish émigré and an aspiring filmmaker, asleep on the couch with an American flag draped over it. Rubbing his eyes to make out the figures clad in black and standing over him, Wyotech stretched his arms and, apparently mistaking the Manson family for friends, asked them, "What time is it?" Tex aimed his gun at Wyotech and said, "Be quiet, don't move, or you're dead." Wyotech stiffened, the gravity of the situation beginning to seize him. "Who are you?" he asked, "and what are you doing here?" "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business," Tex replied, kicking Wyotech in the head. Susan Atkins then found a towel and used it to bind Wyotech's hands as best as she could. Then, on Tex's instructions, she looked through the house, searching for others. She came to a bedroom where she saw a woman reclining on a bed reading. Abigail Folger, 25, the heiress to a coffee fortune. She'd been staying at the house with Wyotech, who was her boyfriend since April. Now, she glanced up from her book, smiled, and waved at Atkins, not realizing the danger. For her part, Atkins responded in kind and continued down the hall. Crazy. Atkins peered into a second bedroom, where a man sat on the edge of a bed talking to a pregnant woman who lay there in lingerie. The man, Jay Sebring, 35, was a hairstylist. His shop in Beverly Hills attracted a wealthy, famous clientele. He'd been the first one to cut hair in a private room as opposed to a barber shop. He'd served in the Navy during the Korean War. An intensely secretive man, he was rumored to allow only 5 people to keep his phone number. On the bed with him was his ex-girlfriend, Sharon Tate, then 26 and 8.5 months pregnant with her first child. She'd recently filmed her biggest role to date in 13 Chairs, and her manager had promised she'd be a star someday. Born in Dallas, Texas, Tate was the daughter of an Army officer. She grew up in cities scattered across the globe. Her beauty was such that she'd apparently stopped traffic, literally, on her first visit to New York. She'd been a homecoming queen and a prom queen. Even at 6 months old, she'd won a Miss Tiny Tot contest in Texas. A film career, she hoped, would get her noticed for something beyond her good looks. There, on Cielo Drive, at the home she called the Love House, Tate was optimistic about her future. She believed her child would strengthen her marriage with Polanski, who sometimes demeaned her. Now, having reported back to Tex, Susan retied Wyotech's hands with a piece of nylon rope. She went to bring the others into the living room, returning with Folger at knife point, and then with Sebring and Tate. "Come with me," she told them. "Don't say a word, or you're dead." In their shock and confusion, they offered the intruders money and whatever else they wanted, begging them not to hurt anyone. Tex ordered the 3 who'd come from their bedrooms to lie face down on their stomachs in front of the fireplace. Sharon Tate began to cry. Tex told her to shut up. Taking a long rope, he tied Sebring's hands behind his back and ran a length around his neck. He looped the rope around Tate's neck next and then Folger's, throwing the rest of it over a beam in the ceiling. Sebring struggled to his feet and protested. Couldn't this man see that Tate was pregnant? He tried to move towards Sharon, and Tex shot him, puncturing a lug. Sebring crumbled onto the zebra skin rug by the fireplace. Since they were all tied together, his collapse forced the screaming Tate and Folger to stand on their toes, to keep them from being strangled. Tex dropped to his knees and began stabbing the hairstylist incessantly. Standing up again, he kicked Sebring in the head. Then he told Krenwinkel to turn off all the lights. "What are you going to do to us?" Sharon Tate asked. "You're all going to die," Tex said. Wyotech had managed to free his hands. He lunged towards Atkins, attempting to disarm her. But she forced her knife into his legs, stabbing him constantly as they rolled across the living room floor, a tangle of limbs glinting with steel. He pulled her long hair, his blood spraying everywhere, and he'd been stabbed more than 6 times. But Wyotech staggered to his feet. Atkins had lost her knife, so he made a run for the front door, and with Atkins still pummeling him, got as far as the lawn. Tex shot him with 2 bullets and then tackled him to the ground, pounding the butt of his gun against the back of his head again and again. He hit him with such force that Wyotech's skull cracked. Inside, Sharon was sobbing. Then Folger, who lifted the noose from her neck, ran down the hall and out the house through a side door. She was halfway across the front lawn when Krenwinkel caught up to her and brought her knife down, stabbing her 28 times. Tex joined in and Folger went limp, saying, "I give up. I'm already dead." Drenched in blood and their own sweat, the 2 killers rose to see Wyotech yet again on his feet stumbling towards them. Soon, they were stabbing him with the same mechanical precision, forcing steel through flesh, bone, and cartilage. The coroner tallied 51 stab wounds to Wyotech, plus 13 blows to the head and 2 bullet wounds. Atkins had remained in the house with Sharon, who was whimpering, sitting on the floor, still only in lingerie and bound by the neck to the dead body of her former lover, Jay Sebring. She was the only one still alive. She was due to give birth to the child, a boy, in 2 weeks. Tex came back inside and ordered Atkins to kill her. Tate begged her to spare her life, to spare her unborn child. "I want to have my baby," she said. "Woman, I have no mercy for you," Atkins responded, locking her arm around Tate's neck from behind. "You're going to die, and I don't feel anything about it." She stabbed her in the stomach. Tex joined in, and the pair stabbed her 16 times until she cried out for her mother and died. Atkins dipped her fingers into one of Tate's wounds and tasted her blood. It was, quote, "warm, sticky, and nice," she'd later recall. "To taste death and yet give life," she said. Wow, what a trick. She soaked a towel in Tate's blood and brought it to the front door, where, following Tex's instruction to write something that would shock the world, she scrawled the word pig. Their work was done. When Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel and Kasabian returned to the Spawn Ranch early that morning, they went to their beds and slept soundly. "I was gone," Atkins later recalled. "It was like I was dead. I could not think about anything. It was almost as if I passed out, blacked out. My head was blank. There was nothing in me. It was like I had given it all." At 150 Cielo Drive was a scene of such callous, barbarous devastation that it shook something loose in the national psyche. August 8th and August 9th suddenly seemed to describe different realities. Media accounts were quick to infer something more sordid than ordinary homicide, something occult had occurred. One paper called the murders a, quote, bloody orgy. Others reported ritualistic slayings and overtones of a weird religious rite. The facts were unavailable or misreported. Maybe drugs were involved. Maybe they weren't. Maybe Sebring had been wearing a black hood of a Satanist. Maybe he hadn't. The big picture was one of supernatural ruin. An officer at the scene said the bodies looked like mannequins dipped in red paint. Another said, "It's like a battlefield up there." Pools of blood had soaked into the carpets. According to Time magazine, stray bullets were lodged in the ceiling. In Roman Polanski, whose films were errantly, even proudly occultist, the public found someone onto whom it could project its fatalism. A popular press account said that mere minutes before he learned of the murders, Polanski, at a party in London, had been discussing a friend's death. "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo," he said. "Who will be the next to go?" With that, the phone rang and he was summoned to hear that his wife and friends had been brutally murdered. But it wasn't over. The next night at the Spawn Ranch, the same group convened with 3 additions. There was 18-year-old Stephen Grogan, a musician and high school dropout, and the 19-year-old Leslie Van Houten, a former homecoming princess from the suburbs of Los Angeles. And then there was Charles Manson, their leader. The 7 of them piled into the beat-up Ford on a search for more victims. After nearly 3 hours of restive driving through Los Angeles and its environs, Manson finally settled on a home in Los Feliz, at 3301 Waverly Drive, next door to a house he'd once stayed in. Manson broke into the house by himself, armed with a pistol and a knife. Others maintained that he brought Tex Watson with him. In any case, he spotted Leno LaBianca, 44 years old, a grocery store owner, asleep on the couch. Leno's wife, Rosemary, 38 years old, was in the bedroom. Rosemary was paranoid that people had been breaking in and moving their furniture around lately, and, like the whole city, she was spooked by the Tate murders the previous night. Even so, Manson was apparently able to walk right in through an unlocked door, and he tied up the couple by himself. Then, Manson rejoined his followers at the bottom of the long driveway, where they were waiting in the car. Manson chose Tex and Krenwinkel again as his executioners. This time he added Van Houten to the mix too. She'd never so much as struck a person before that night. Regardless, he told the 3 of them to go inside and kill everyone. They had only buck knives. They burst into the house, separated the couple, and stabbed Leno 26 times. They carved the word war into his stomach and impaled a carving fork beside it, its handle jutting out of his belly. And they left a steak knife protruding from his neck. Rosemary suffered 41 stab wounds, many inflicted after she'd already died. Before they left, the killer scrawled "Helter Skelter" in blood on the refrigerator, a reference to the Beatles song Helter Skelter, though they misspelt it. On the walls, they smeared "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" in Leno's blood. The bloodshed in its primitive defiance, a pregnant star slaughtered, a man punctured with kitchen utensils, confirmed a sense of rupture in America. The 60s subversive spirit had come on with too much fervor. Some reckoning was bound to happen, or so it seemed in retrospect. The nation was immured in these events, in the motive, the manhunt, and then in 1970, the sensational 9.5-month-long trial. But after the murders, Manson and his followers were not brought to justice for nearly 4 months. With the suspects unknown and at large, rumors proliferated and the tension reached a fever pitch. For a while, the police maintained that the two sets of murders, the LaBianca Tate murders, were unrelated. They claimed the LaBiancas were the victims of a copycat attack. As days turned into weeks and weeks to months, two separate teams of LAPD detectives, one assigned to Tate, the other to the LaBiancas, failed to share information, believing that the crimes were unconnected. As they lost valuable time pursuing false leads, doubt and ridicule followed them in the press. For almost 4 months, the police would say that they had no real idea who had committed the murders, some of the most appalling murders in the history of the country. As journalist Joan Didion famously stated, the 60s abruptly ended on August 9, 1969. The tension broke that day. The paranoia was fulfilled. There's a germ of truth in what she said, but the process wasn't so abrupt. It began that day, but it wasn't over really until December 1st, 1969, the day the police announced the crimes had been solved and the nation got its first glimpse of the killers. Here was the final fulfillment of that paranoia, the last gasp of 60s idealism. At LAPD headquarters, the chief of police, Edward M. Davis, stepped up to an array of 15 microphones and announced to a stunned crowd of 200 reporters that the case was solved. Warrants were out for Charles Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. More people would be named pending grand jury indictments. Davis added, to everyone's astonishment, that the Tate LaBianca murders were connected. The suspects may have been responsible for a series of other unresolved homicides too. Police Chief Davis didn't name Manson or Susan Atkins that day because they were already in custody. In mid-October, Manson, with a welter of his followers, had been apprehended on auto theft charges at the Barker Ranch, a hideaway in the forbidding Death Valley, several hours away from Los Angeles. Its seclusion surpassed even that of the Spahn Ranch. Atkins had been charged with another unrelated murder, that of Gary Hinman, an old friend of Manson. She was being held at the Sybil Brand Institute, a jail for women in Los Angeles County, where she bragged to cellmates about her complicity in the Tate murders. Those offhand remarks broke the case open for the LAPD, who began to connect the dots they'd been staring at for nearly 4 months. Journalists dug into the story. Images of Manson and the family were emblazoned on front pages and TV screens around the world. The cognitive dissonance was intense. These weren't the faces of hardened criminals or escaped lunatics. They were hippies, stereotypical flower children. In the bloom of wide-eyed youth, the men unshaven and long-haired, wearing beads and buckskin jackets. The women in blue jeans and tie-dyed tops, no bras, and their hair tangled and unwashed. They talk like hippies, too, spouting an ethos of free love, eschewing monogamy and marriage in favor of sexual experimentation. They lived in roaming communes, caravanning along the Golden Coast in Technicolor bright buses and clunkers cobbled together from spare parts. They believed that hallucinations strengthened the spirit and expanded the mind. They gave birth naturally and raised their children together in rustic simplicity. In other ways, though, their philosophy was Gnostic, verging on theological. Time did not exist, they proclaimed. There was no good, no bad, and no death. All human beings were God and the devil at the same time and part of one another. The family's moral code, insofar as it existed at all, was riven with contradictions. While it was wrong to kill animals, according to their philosophy, even the snakes and spiders in their bunkhouses had to be carefully spared. It was fine to kill people, because, according to them, human life was inherently valueless. To kill a person was tantamount to, quote, breaking off a minute piece of some cosmic cookie, as Tex Watson later put it. If anything, according to their philosophy, death was something to be embraced, because it exposed your soul to the oneness of the universe. Where had these beliefs come from? The murderers had been raised and educated for the most part in solid conventional American communities. So what happened? The promise of the hippie movement had been in its willingness to forego cherished institutions in favor of the new and untested. The Manson family, with its starry-eyed communalism, sexual frankness, and veneration of LSD, offered a screen onto which anyone could project his insecurities about the era's politics and pressures. After the Tate murders, it seemed that hippies and freaks were more than a risible sideshow. They could really undermine the status quo. Their promiscuity had always earned a lot of finger-wagging from concerned moralists, while others had looked on with thinly veiled envy. Parents were worried about their kids that they would drop out, become hippies, and never get decent jobs. Everywhere, kids were hitchhiking. The consensus from the quote-unquote straight world was that hippies were mostly harmless, but you didn't want to be one. While there had been isolated incidents of violence attributed to hippies, none of it was as horrific, premeditated, or systematic as the murders committed by the Manson family. On December 12th, a piece in Time magazine drew parallels between hippies and violence. In the movement's Invitation to Freedom, the magazine warned, criminals and psychotics blossomed as easily as innocents and pacifists did. But how, Time asked, could children who had dropped out for the sake of kindness and caring, love and beauty, end up killing? End quote. This is one of the main arguments that the author Tom O'Neill is making with this book. I'm not really giving anything away here because he's done several interviews about this, where he discusses that his theory is that what happened with the Mansons wasn't some sort of random act, but rather Manson was a CIA asset, and that these murders were meant to put a massive stain on the hippie movement, because the government considered the hippie movement a threat in many regards. I'm paraphrasing here essentially, I'm oversimplifying it, but basically, this is one of the main arguments Tom O'Neill makes. Now, switching gears, I'm going to share with you the Izzy Stradlin Gilby Clark section of this video. Izzy Stradlin is the original rhythm guitarist from Guns N' Roses, a very important member of the band who wrote and co-wrote some of Guns N' Roses' most iconic songs. Now, fans filming concerts is very common today, but it wasn't back in the early 90s. During a Guns N' Roses concert on July the 2nd, 1991, in Maryland Heights, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis, an incident took place. During a rendition of Rocket Queen, Axl Rose noticed that a fan was filming the show with a camera. After asking the venue security to take the camera away, Axl himself jumped into the audience and confronted the fan. Axl was subsequently pulled away from the audience by security. Once back on stage, Axl announced to the crowd that he's going home, slamming his mic on the ground and walking off stage, eventually joined by the rest of the band. The angered crowd proceeded to riot, leading to dozens of injuries and significant damage to the venue. Police were unable to arrest Axl Rose until nearly a year later, due to the fact that Guns N' Roses were touring overseas. Charges were filed against Axl Rose, but a judge ruled that Axl did not directly incite the riot. In his defense, Axl Rose stated that the Guns N' Roses security team had made 4 separate requests to the venue security staff to remove the camera, which apparently were ignored, and that other members of the band had reported being hit by bottles thrown at them from the audience, while the security staff refused to enforce a drinking limit. Now, this type of incident wasn't unique to the St. Louis concert, however, as a similar type of incident nearly unfolded on August 24th, 1991, at a Guns N' Roses concert in Mannheim, Germany. Guns N' Roses is infamous for being a band which had trouble following them wherever they went. The unnecessary drama that followed Guns N' Roses was not something Izzy Stradlin was willing to deal with any longer. On November 7th, 1991, Izzy Stradlin quit the band. Izzy himself cited a combination of Axl Rose's behavior, his apparent mismanagement of the band, and various difficulties being around Slash, Matt Sorum, and Duff McKagan, who at the time still had various addictions, while Izzy Stradlin himself was now sober. The combination of all these different reasons led to him eventually departing Guns N' Roses. In Izzy Stradlin's own words, quote, "Once I quit drugs, I couldn't help looking around and asking myself, is this all there is? I was just tired of it. I needed to get out." Guns N' Roses had to find a replacement for Izzy Stradlin within 3 weeks of his departure, or they would have had to have canceled several shows. Dave Navarro from Jane's Addiction was considered, but in the end, Gilby Clark was chosen. Slash himself has credited Gilby Clark for having saved the band. Interestingly, in 1993, Gilby Clark broke his arm in a motorcycle accident and was replaced for several weeks by Izzy Stradlin. I got to do an interview with Gilby Clark for my documentary, What is Classic Rock? If you'd like to see that documentary, the links are available in the description box below. During my interview with Gilby Clark, we talk about a variety of different subjects. Everything I do is original, so if you like my work, make sure to subscribe for more. Now, here is my interview with Gilby Clark.
All the greatest songwriters, musicians, performers didn't really give a shit what anybody thought about them. They did it for themselves. It's a very selfish act. I mean, that's the way I've always felt. It's like when I'm making music, I do it for myself. I make a record that I want to buy. I don't do it because I know what my fans want. You know, to me, that's chasing your tail. You know, that's the ultimate sellout, in my opinion. And I hear that so much. But people, today's artists, what they call today's artists, which I really don't consider them artists. I just consider them product. It's just, so that's what I want to see. I want to see somebody that's just unique, some rock and roll that just doesn't give a shit, you know, that, you know, if they get famous, you know, from making some great music, then, hey, that's the bonus, but they're really in it for themselves and to just, you know, they have this passion inside them. I just want to see that passion back.
What would you like to see changed?
What I'd like to see is I want to see more rock and roll. I really do. It's like everything is so nice and pretty and the package is so intricate. You know, what I love about rock and roll is that freedom aspect to it, that there are no rules. You know, it's like you don't really give a shit what other people think. To me, that's what's great about rock and roll. That's the decadent part of it. You know, that's the anarchist part of it. When I was in high school, and granted we're going back a long ways, and classic rock bands like Zeppelin and all these bands we've talked about, you know, were popular, and I wanted to, you know, be a musician. I wanted to play guitar, and I wanted to be in a band. It was really easy for me to start a band. You know, there were at least 4 or 5 drummers in my high school. There were 10 bass players. There were 20 guitar players, and there were 3 singers. You know, when my daughter, who is now 21 and in college, when she was in high school and she wanted to start a band, she played guitar and she was really into the same music that I grew up with. There was 1 drummer in her high school. There was 1 bass player. There were about 5 to 10 guitar players and 600 singers. How I define classic rock is pretty much any music before 1980 is the way I've always thought of it. To me, classic rock is Led Zeppelin. Classic rock is Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, Aerosmith, Kiss. And I know that there's genres in between all those. Some are metal bands, some are just rock bands. But to me, that's what classic rock is. I think over time, classic rock has changed. You know, in my opinion, Guns N' Roses is now classic rock, you know. The bands from the 90s have now moved into it. So I honestly don't really know what the pinpoint definition is. But if you ask me who's classic rock, in my opinion, I could tell you who that is. For myself, when I was younger and I moved from Cleveland to Los Angeles and to really get in the band and to be into music and you know, make my mark, it was actually a lot easier than you would think. First of all, I had a center to go to, which was Hollywood. You know, things were happening in Hollywood. You know, there were a lot of great bands coming along. Great bands that were unsigned, that didn't have great bands. I mean, when some of us that were around during that time, we get together and we talk about that, it blows our minds how many bands were great that never made a record, that at that time weren't good enough, but in our minds, oh my God, this band was fantastic. We all had a common language. You know, music was a common language. It was really easy to talk to somebody when I was out in a club that had long black hair. Oh my God, you know, do you like the New York Dolls? Yeah, I love the New York Dolls. And we immediately were friends. We had something in common. There's something that a lot of modern artists say that drives me insane. And that's that quote, "I do it for the fans." That just drives me insane. That, to me, that's just not an artist. An artist's job is to come up with something original, unique, and they do it for themselves because they have this passion and they have this gift. Nowadays, there's just so many genres and so many subgenres that, it's impossible. Do you like punk rock music? Well, yeah, I mean, that's, it's Green Day, it's it's the Clash. I mean, it's so many different genres within a genre. It's really hard to kind of pick people that you want to play with and work with.
Where is the line between metal and hard rock? How do you start to distinguish the two?
In my opinion, where the line is drawn between metal and classic rock really has to do with the guitar playing. I mean, as a guitar player, that is my opinion. And it really has to do kind of with the overdrive or the distortion in the guitar. It's like when you listen, to Bad Company, yeah, it's a Les Paul and a Marshall, but it's a different Les Paul and a Marshall than, Metallica. Metallica is just so much more overdriven, crazy pentatonic scales and things like that, and whammy bars and things like that. I can pinpoint the difference of the bands, who I think is metal and who I think is classic rock, and I guess trying to define the word or the description is actually difficult, but to me it's in the guitar playing. Is the guitar player a metal guitar player, or is the guitar player a rock and roll guitar player? And I guess when we were talking earlier about blues bass, that's absolutely the borderline. To me, all those bands, Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Sabbath, all were major blues influenced bands. But later on, once Eddie Van Halen came along, it really changed everything. Hendrix changed all those guys, but Eddie Van Halen changed all these guitar players. In my opinion, the decline of hard rock music is a lot of different factors. I do think it's the fact that hard rock music really isn't at the forefront anymore. It's not selling millions of records like it did in its heyday. Are record executives at fault? That's a little bit of it, but in my opinion, music, rock and roll, anything is really kind of new. We're really only 30, 40 years into it, from when Elvis really started rock and roll. And it was inevitable that it would get to this point where it gets a little stagnant. It's like there are only 12 notes, so there really is only so much you can do. I mean, now, there's, millions of guitar players all trying to think of that riff, but Smoke on the Water's already been done. Cashmere's already been done. It really is more than anything is there, getting a new, fresh idea, trying to get it out there. So it's a fault of a lot of people why rock, in my opinion, has declined a little bit. What I want to say about the current state of classic rock more than anything is I do have hope. I really do. I mean, I was around in the 80s when things were really bleak. There was a lot of generic music. There was a lot of boring, bad records out, and there was no rock radio stations. There were no rock concerts. There was nothing. And then bands like Guns N' Roses came along. I mean, even bands like Poison. And, there were bands that came into Los Angeles that really were good bands that made a difference, and they changed the whole thing. So I want to just say that I do have hope. There can be a new young band, with a whole new creative outlook that can really take this in a new direction and spark a new generation to do it. But just remember, back in those days, the bands that were great back then took a great singer, a great guitar player, a great bass player, and a great drummer, keyboard player, whatever. It took these unique, great parts to make one sum. Nowadays, most of the bands will have like a great guitar player or a great singer or like one person, and then, the other guys in the band are in 10 different bands. That's really what it's going to take. It's really going to take some, some commitment, some sacrifices to really get some new young band. But I do have hope. I honestly do have hope. I really do think that can change because I saw it happen with my own eyes years and years ago. And I do think it's possible because I do think people are still passionate about music. And I do think music is an important part of people's lives. And therefore, how can you let a genre like classic rock die?